So we need to move on and look at the data we obtained from the other mixtures. So in the next mixture, the patient sample, the test material, was diluted 1:2 before we mixed with pooled normal plasma, 1:2. We made the mix, we've got the clotting times. So the 1:5 dilution, 77 seconds here. The 1:10 dilution, 81 here. And the 1:20 dilution, 90.7, 91 seconds. So here. So now we want to know, do we have a straight line relationship parallel to the standard? What will be the line of best fit? Once again, it's not a perfect line, fairly typical of inhibitor assays. Line of best fit, parallel to the standard. Not every point is exactly on the line. Where does the line of best fit cut the 100% line? Here. So we go across to the standard. From here, drop a perpendicular. Residual factor 8, 30%. Above 25, it's possible to make a quantitative calculation from this figure, which we'll do in a moment. Next dilution of patient sample. Pre-diluted 1:4, mixed with pooled normal plasma. Clotting times, 70 seconds. 76. 83. So, line of best fit. So we have a straight line relationship. Once again, not every point exactly on the line. Where does it cut the 100%? Here. What's the concentration of standard, which would plot at this time? Actually, it's absolutely on 50% residual. Final patient dilution, diluted 1:8. Clotting times, 65, 72, 78, 78.5 here. Line of best fit. Across to the standard line. Drop a perpendicular. It's around 85, 86% residual. It's above that critical level of 65, 70. Above this, we can't make use of that figure to draw any safe conclusions about inhibitor concentration. So we can't use the 85%. We can't use the 13%. So that leaves us two results. The 1:2 dilution, 30% residual. The 1:4 dilution, 50% residual. So we need now to convert those residual factor 8s into inhibitor concentration. To convert the residual factor 8 into a Bethesda inhibitor concentration, we need log linear graph paper, and that's what we have here. On the logarithmic scale, on the vertical axis, we have the residual factor 8. 100%, 90, 80, 70, 60 and so on. 50%, 40, 30, 20, 10. Residual factor 8. And then on the x-axis, we have the inhibitor concentration. 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 and so on. And we have two known pieces of information. The first one, if we have no loss of factor 8, 100% residual, there is no inhibitor present. Zero inhibitor, 100% residual factor 8. And that's here. That's this point. Zero inhibitor, 100% factor 8. So this is a given. We have a second piece of information, which comes from the international definition. 1 unit per mil. 1 Bethesda unit per mil factor VIII inhibitor destroys 50% of the added factor VIII in 2 hours at 37. Destroys 50%, residual 50%. So we know that 50% residual here is equal to 1 Bethesda unit per mil. These are the two pieces of information. And we use that with a straight line in this way. So this piece of information has not yet used anything experimental. This is simply from the definitions. So this we can construct anytime. We only need to do this once. We can use this to convert residual factor VIII into Bethesda inhibitor concentrations tomorrow, next week, and that's fine. Turning to our QC sample. The residual factor VIII, 46%. Where is 46 on this line? And the answer is here. It means the concentration of inhibitor in this mix is 1.1 Bethesda units per mil. In that mix. How did we construct that mixture? We made a dilution of the QC material 1 in 20. So the inhibitor concentration in that sample is 1.1 multiplied by 20, 22 Bethesda units per mil. So our first question, what did we expect for this? And the anticipated range, the target range in my laboratory for this particular sample is from 14 Bethesda units to 25. That's quite a wide range. And that's to take account of the variability in the assay. It's an indication of the degree of imprecision which can occur. Is that result inside the range? Yes. It means the assay has been successful. It means we can safely release the patient results for patient management purposes. Turning to the patient sample. When we tested this without pre-dilution, undiluted, 13% residual, it's below the limit, below that critical figure of 25, which could safely be converted to inhibitor. We can't use it. Second patient dilution, the one which was pre-diluted 1 in 2, 30% residual. We come to the graph. Where is 30% residual? Here. What is the concentration of inhibitor that would be associated with 30% residual factor VIII? 1.7. That sample was pre-diluted 1 in 2. So the concentration in the patient, 1.7 multiplied by 2, 3.4 Bethesda units per mil. Next patient dilution. We pre-diluted 1 in 4, more dilute. We've taken the antibody concentration lower. The residual factor VIII, 50%. I don't need the graph. 50% from the international definition, 1 unit per mil. So that contains 1 unit per mil, 1 Bethesda unit per mil, multiplied by 4 for dilution, 4.0. So for those two dilutions, we have not obtained identical answers, 3.4, 4.0. And in my experience, that kind of variability is rather typical of the assay. And I think there are two approaches. Some centres will say, I will take the dilution in which the residual is closest to 50. And there's no doubt the accuracy of the assay is better at in that area. So some centres would take the 50% and report this as 4 Bethesda units per mil. Actually, in my own centre, we take the view that we get additional information, and I think usable information. So in my centre, we take the average. Any of those residual factor VIIIs in that range 25 to 70, we use those and we take an average. So in my centre, we would report this as 3.7, an average of the two results. Of course, the clinical management decision is really unaffected by that part of the decision. If we report as 4.0, if we report as 3.7, that's the same management decision for that patient. And I think it's something we have to accept from inhibitor assays, that this type of variability will occur. If this were a patient with acquired haemophilia, what we notice is fairly typically we don't recover similar final estimates of antibody concentration from different dilutions. Actually quite the reverse. It's often the case for samples from patients with acquired haemophilia, it's often the case that the higher the dilution before constructing the mixtures, the higher that dilution, the higher is the ultimate estimate of inhibitor concentration. And this can be very difficult. It means that if we're monitoring change response to therapy, for example, in a patient with acquired haemophilia, it's really important to reproduce carefully those same dilutions. So if we produce an answer from a dilution here of 1 in 4, if we want to look for whether or not there's been a change, we should once again test a 1 in 4 dilution. If that's increasing, that's an evidence that the antibody overall is increasing. If it's reducing, that could be evidence that therapy is beginning to be successful. So that's, I think, an important thing to keep in mind. The test sample which we assayed just now, this was from a patient with severe haemophilia outside of treatment, so with no factor VIII in the test sample. Sometimes we want to make this assay, frequently we want to make this assay in a sample in which there is factor VIII present before we move into the inhibitor test. And this has an important implication and has an influence on our assay. We need to take the level of factor VIII into account. And there are 3 ways that this can be done. If the patient sample contains factor VIII, when we make the equal mix, patient with pooled normal plasma, some factor VIII is provided by the patient sample. Not the case here, but would have been so if there were factor VIII present in the patient sample. So the starting point in that mixture is higher, the level of factor VIII is higher than the level in the control mix, equal part same pooled normal, but with a completely deficient plasma. In this setting, a higher level in the starting mixture. So we can take that into account when we calculate the residual. That's one possibility, and the mechanism to do this is described in the WFH laboratory manual. That's one possibility. Another possibility is to make an adjustment in the control mixture. So if we know that the patient has a starting level of, let's say, 40 international units per deciliter factor VIII, and we know that the pooled normal plasma we're using has a starting level of, say, 100 international units per deciliter, that mixture will have 140% of the level in the control mix. So we could adjust the control mix, the ratio of pooled normal plasma to factor VIII deficient, to a similar level. That's possible, and that's also described in the laboratory manual. But increasingly what centres are doing in this setting, and I think this might be the best approach, is to heat the patient sample, subject the patient sample to heating before constructing these mixtures. And the way that's done is to put the patient sample at 56 degrees for a period of time. It denatures the factor VIII but does not denature IgG antibody. This is stable under those conditions, though the anti-factor VIII antibody is unaffected. If that antibody were bound to any factor VIII, perhaps during immune tolerance induction, for example, then the factor VIII bound will be removed, will be degraded, and that antibody will be released. Sometimes that's a useful measure to do. So it's possible to do this by heating the plasma. The temperature used is 56 in studies. The period of incubation, some studies have used 30 minutes, others have recommended 90 minutes. For sure 90 minutes ensures absolutely full degradation. In my own experience, 30 minutes actually takes the factor VIII really, really low and may well be sufficient, and of course allows us to proceed with the assay a little quicker. So we can use any of these approaches, but probably this mechanism of destruction by heat treatment I think is increasingly the favoured option. All of the techniques that we've described and that we've demonstrated are described in some detail in the WFH laboratory manual, and so again I'd like to refer you to that. It's available as a free download. We've used the manual method in the water bath, and I hope you can see that we're able to obtain good results, that it can be used for patient management. Of course it may be an advantage to use an automated system. We can improve the precision, but either is perfectly acceptable.